In 1307, a device was built that could keep a man alive for 3 days while his body was slowly torn apart, joint by joint, inch by inch. And the worst part? The people who designed it called themselves men of justice. They wrote instruction manuals. They trained specialists. They kept detailed records of every scream. Medieval torture was not random cruelty. It was a system, a legal system. And what that system reveals about human nature is far more disturbing than any device ever built. To understand medieval torture, you have to forget everything modern movies have shown you. This was not chaos. This was bureaucracy. Between the 12th and 18th centuries, torture was a legally sanctioned method of extracting confessions across Europe. Courts required it. Judges ordered it. And the Catholic Church perfected it. The legal framework came from Roman law. A confession was considered the highest form of evidence. Without one, conviction was nearly impossible. So the courts found a solution. They would force the confession out. Every kingdom had its own regulations. How long a session could last. Which instruments were permitted. How many witnesses had to be present. There were even rules about who could be tortured and who was exempt. Nobility often escaped. The poor did not. Skilled torturers were paid professionals. They studied anatomy. They understood exactly how much pain a human body could endure before passing out. Their job was to keep the subject conscious, alert, screaming, because a confession spoken while unconscious had no legal value. The system was designed not just to break bodies, it was designed to break minds while keeping them aware. The most infamous device was the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The prisoner was strapped down, wrists bound to one roller, ankles to the other. Then the torturer turned the handles. Slowly, the body stretched. Ligaments tore first, then muscles separated from bone, shoulders dislocated with a sound witnesses described as a wet crack, knees followed, hips followed. The spine extended beyond its natural limit, and the prisoner remained conscious through all of it. Sessions could last hours, sometimes days. The torturer would pause, ask questions, and then resume. The rack was considered a moderate instrument, legally appropriate for suspected heretics and political prisoners. Courts authorized it routinely. But the breaking wheel was something else entirely. Used primarily in Germanic territories and France, the wheel was reserved for the most serious crimes: murder, treason, witchcraft. The prisoner was tied to a large wooden wheel, laid flat on the ground. The executioner used an iron-tipped club to systematically shatter every major bone, arms first, then legs, working from the extremities inward. Each blow was precise, calculated. The executioner followed a specific order dictated by the court. After the bones were broken, the body was threaded through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel was then raised on a tall pole in the public square, and there the prisoner was left, still alive, exposed to the elements and to the crows. Death could take days. The public watched. They brought their children. It was considered a moral lesson. Now, you might think these were the worst devices ever designed. You would be wrong. The instruments I have described so far were meant for public spectacle. They served a political purpose. The crowd had to see the punishment to fear the state. But there were other devices, hidden ones, used in private chambers below stone cathedrals and castle dungeons. These were designed not for spectacle. They were designed for information. The Inquisition operated under different rules. Their torture sessions were documented in meticulous Latin records that survived for centuries. And those records describe methods that make the rack look primitive. The inquisitors were scholars, theologians, men who believed they were saving souls. And that belief gave them permission to do things no ordinary court would authorize. They developed psychological techniques alongside physical ones, showing a prisoner the instruments before using them, letting them hear another prisoner screaming in the next room, making them wait for hours, days, in complete darkness before a session began. The Inquisition understood something modern psychology would not formally describe for another 500 years. Anticipation of pain is often worse than pain itself. The Judas Cradle was one of the Inquisition's preferred tools. A tall wooden stool with a sharp, pyramid-shaped point at the top. The prisoner was hoisted above it with ropes, then slowly lowered. The point entered the body. Gravity did the rest. The process was excruciating. The torturer controlled the descent with pulleys. They could lower the prisoner a fraction of an inch at a time, or drop them suddenly. The weight of the body pressed against the point with increasing force. Sessions could last 12 hours or more. The prisoner could not shift their weight. They could not escape the pressure. And the pyramid was never cleaned between uses. Infection was part of the design. But water torture was perhaps the most psychologically devastating method. The prisoner was restrained on a tilted board, mouth forced open with a metal clamp. Then water was poured into the mouth continuously. The prisoner had to swallow or drown. Liters. The stomach distended. Internal pressure built until organs compressed against each other. In the Spanish Inquisition's version, a cloth was placed over the face. Water was poured onto the cloth. The prisoner experienced the sensation of drowning without actually dying. Over and over. For hours. The body's panic response never adapted. Every single repetition felt like the first time dying. Court records from Seville in 1491 describe a session lasting 6 hours. The prisoner confessed to heresy, witchcraft, and consorting with demons. He confessed to crimes that had not even occurred. He would have confessed to anything, and that was the fundamental flaw of the entire system. Torture does not produce truth. It produces compliance. Every modern study of interrogation confirms what medieval prisoners demonstrated with their broken bodies. Under enough pain, a person will say whatever the torturer wants to hear. The Inquisition knew this. Their own records prove it. Prisoners confessed to flying on broomsticks, to attending banquets with the devil, to transforming into animals under the full moon. The Inquisitors recorded these confessions as fact. They used them as evidence in trials. And they executed people based on statements everyone in the room knew were impossible. So why did the system continue? Because torture was never really about truth. It was about power. The confession was a performance, a ritual that legitimized authority. The state needed the prisoner to speak the words. Not because the words were true, but because the act of speaking them proved the state's absolute dominion over the individual. The torturer was not searching for information. He was manufacturing submission, and the more elaborate the instruments became, the more clearly they communicated a single message to every citizen. This is what happens to those who resist. But there were devices designed for something even darker than submission. Rat torture required no complex machinery. A metal bucket was placed upside down on the prisoner's bare stomach. Inside the bucket, a live rat. Then the torturer heated the outside of the bucket with coals. As the metal grew hot, the rat panicked. It had only one way to escape, downward, through the prisoner's body. The rat would gnaw through flesh, muscle, and organ to flee the heat. The process took hours. The prisoner remained conscious for most of it. The strappado was simpler, but devastating. The prisoner's wrists were bound behind their back. Then they were hoisted into the air by those bound wrists. The shoulders dislocated immediately. The full weight of the body hung from joints that were never designed to bear load in that direction. Weights were sometimes added to the ankles. The torturer would raise and drop the prisoner repeatedly. Each drop tore the joints further apart. Then, there was the pear of anguish, a metal device shaped like a pear, inserted into the mouth, throat, or other body cavities. A screw mechanism at the base allowed the torturer to slowly expand the device. The metal segments opened outward, stretching tissue beyond its limit. It was used primarily on accused blasphemers, liars, and women accused of witchcraft. These were not the inventions of madmen. They were approved by courts, sanctioned by bishops, filed in official records. Here is what no one talks about: the torturers themselves. Who were these men? What kind of person volunteers for this work? And what happened to them? Historical records reveal something deeply unsettling. Most torturers were ordinary citizens, tradesmen, craftsmen. Some were former soldiers. They applied for the position. They were interviewed. They were tested on their knowledge of anatomy and their ability to remain calm under pressure. Many served for decades. They married, had children, attended church on Sundays. Their neighbors knew what they did for a living. In some cities, the torturer was a respected civic official. He was paid well. He had job security. The psychological profile of these men challenges everything we want to believe about human nature. They were not monsters. They were professionals. They followed procedures. They went home at night and slept soundly, and that might be the most disturbing revelation of all. The capacity for cruelty does not require madness. It only requires permission. By the 16th century, torture had become an industry. Craftsmen competed to design more effective instruments. Blacksmiths specialized in torture devices the way others specialized in horseshoes or plows. There were catalogs, illustrated manuals showing judges which device was appropriate for which crime. The system had its own economy, its own supply chain, its own professional class. And the public spectacle grew larger. Executions drew thousands. Cities scheduled them on market days to maximize attendance. Vendors sold food and drink. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. The suffering of the condemned was entertainment, a community event, a celebration of order over chaos. But something began to change in the 17th century. Writers and philosophers started questioning the system. Cesare Beccaria published his treatise on crimes and punishment in 1764. He argued that torture was not only cruel, but ineffective. That confessions obtained through pain were worthless. That the purpose of justice should be prevention, not vengeance. His ideas spread across Europe like fire. Frederick the Great abolished torture in Prussia. France followed after the Revolution. England had already moved away from judicial torture decades earlier. By the 19th century, the great machines of pain were being dismantled. Some were preserved in museums. Most were simply destroyed, but the knowledge survived. The techniques developed in medieval dungeons did not disappear. They evolved. Water torture became waterboarding. Stress positions replaced the strappado. Sensory deprivation replaced the dark cell. The language changed. The legal frameworks changed. The fundamental mechanics of inflicting suffering on a restrained human being did not change at all. The medieval torturer would recognize every modern interrogation technique. He would only be surprised that we pretend they are something new. The darkest secret of medieval torture is not the devices. It is not the screaming or the blood or the broken bones. The darkest secret is how normal it was, how completely ordinary people participated in extraordinary cruelty, and how they justified every moment of it with the language of law, order, and divine purpose. We study these instruments behind glass cases in museums and tell ourselves we have evolved, that we are different, that such things could never happen again. But the 20th century proved otherwise. And the 21st century continues to prove it still. The capacity for organized cruelty lives in every civilization. It does not require evil people. It only requires a system that gives ordinary people permission, a legal framework, a religious justification, a political necessity. Once those structures exist, the volunteers appear. They always appear. The medieval torturer was not a monster from another age. He was a preview, a warning written in iron and blood that we have chosen over and over again to ignore. If you found this story as disturbing as I did, subscribe.